Today I'm going to cover the princesses. These girls crush a lot of bases with a strong movement package and long-term value from minion recycling. They can brick in short games, but they'll maintain about equally strong win rates with any number of players in the game, which is one reason why I like them. With the Ghost video, I had to start by explaining a bunch of cards and tactics because if you don't understand how to play the Ghost correctly, and beginning players really don't, their matchups make absolutely no sense. Fortunately, for this video, you can see the princess's basic strategy immediately. Drop bigger stuff than your opponents can, ignore most removal because you have 5s for every minion, and outmaneuver everyone with the movement package. I think the one tricky thing to realize about the princesses is they're a movement faction first and foremost. After all, movement does a lot more when you're moving 5s than when you're moving 3s. Matchup-wise, 3-player gets the most interesting for the princesses because you can't assign them one single power level. If you're drafting from a very large faction pool, such as, say, all 50 factions for only 3 players, princesses sit down somewhere around the 10th best faction. On the other hand, if you pick from a set of only 6 random factions every game, princesses might just become the best faction in the game. Why? Because busting a good princess deck's movement package requires a decent amount of speed from both opposing decks, not just one. See, the princesses have a little trick up their sleeves. They can gift one opponent first place at a base while they grab a very efficient second place. And here I mean efficient in terms of victory points earned per minion power. 1 victory point to 3 minion power is about average. At the same base, and when the princesses have one weak opponent, they pretty reliably use that one weak opponent as a tool to beat the stronger one. The movement package allows you to force another player to work with you against their will, and in this way you earn more VP per minion power than the other players. You can keep the VP per turn pace with even such a strong faction as robots or zombies, and once Sleeping Beauty and direct-to-DVD sequel stack your deck, your late game will be just as good as theirs. The princesses can in fact hold even with robots and zombies in a 3-player endgame as long as the game has lasted enough turns before they reach that endgame, and they actually have a whole bunch of 5s built up in their hand. Now, all of that rosy outlook only applies against one fast deck. If you're facing 2 fast decks, you're in a lot more trouble. Your opponents can do a lot more between each of your turns when there's 2 of them, and they reach a critical mass of how much happens between each of your turns. Since your movement abilities, other than one special, you have to play them all on your turn, they involve a certain amount of planning ahead of time and taking a look and seeing what's the base going to look like next turn. And with 2 fast decks, you can't even predict whether a base is going to be in play on your next turn, let alone about how much power will be there. You also run into the problem that with 2 fast decks, you might not have a safe opponent to gift first place to because both your opponents are ahead of you, and manipulating their scores relative to each other aren't going to do you much good if you're trying to actually win. You also don't get to reach your late game when Sleeping Beauty and direct-to-DVD sequel becomes super, super good. So in short, princesses can beat robots, princesses can beat zombies. If princesses have to deal with robots in one deck and zombies in the other deck, they're probably dead. 2-player is a lot simpler for the princesses. Princesses are a top 10 faction. Princesses are not a top 4 faction. Princesses are also a high variance faction, and that may be one of their more interesting characteristics. They score a lot of upsets against stronger decks when they draw well. They suffer a lot of upsets against weaker decks when they draw poorly because all of their power is concentrated in 6 different minions. And finally, the Geeks tend to counter the princesses because the princesses have one extremely powerful special. Someday My Prince Will Come is so good in a 2-player game in general that the Geeks are absolutely happy to save one of their 2 counter spells as soon as they draw it, and just wait until they see Someday My Prince Will Come and refuse to hit anything else with that counterspell until then. You can deal with this counter a little bit with the princesses by picking a partner faction like Miskatonic, Astronites, or Orcs that have specials of their own. Since the Geeks are being so careful about stopping Someday My Prince Will Come, the other faction specials are going to get to go off more often. And most of the time, this will give you partial compensation against the geeks countering your princesses, although in the case of the orcs, it might be full compensation. When I'm talking about partial versus full compensation in a counter matchup, I mean that the orc princesses should actually perform at the strength of orcs plus princesses against geeks, rather than orcs plus princesses against geeks, but we chop some points off the orcs and princesses because the princesses are getting countered. Other than that, I don't think there's a lot of exceptionally good or bad matchups for the princesses. Cthulhu looks like a good counter on paper if you observe the fact that corruption destroys a minion and doesn't check for its power, but Cthulhu has a problem against the princesses. Cthulhu generally doesn't like to face movement factions, and the princesses have a really nice movement package. As far as partners, the princesses are sort of one of your really nice factions to get early on in a draft, because they're the polar opposite of the ghosts. The ghosts had all these good partner factions, all these crappy partner factions, and you could never predict whether they were going to perform like a 1200 faction or a 1550 faction with any given partner if you weren't familiar with it. The princesses are going to be about the same with just about anything. Yes, you want more specials against geeks, but other than that, princesses are princesses. Their really important cards don't have power caps and can affect either friendly or enemy minions, and this means that cards like True Love's Kiss, you can use these cards in a way that fits whatever your partner faction isn't covering. Even the stuff that you would think wouldn't work with princesses tends to work about fine. I expected that Innsmouth Princesses would be a super awkward deck because you would have only 2 and 5 power minions, and because of that, there would be times when tactically you need to hit a certain power total and they just don't add up. That turned out to be nothing. The faction performs like this, some of its parts. Plants are something I've heard other good players suggest would be bad with princesses. I gave them a shot. It turns out that they're not nearly as bad as you expect. The idea behind plant princesses being bad are Sprout and Venus Mantrap. Sprout targets a friendly 3-power minion. The princesses aren't providing you any. Venus Mantrap targets a friendly 2-power minion. The princesses aren't providing you any. And in fact, Sprout and Venus Mantrap get a lot worse when you're playing with the princesses. The thing is, Sprout and Venus Mantrap and Water Lily all end up making the princesses themselves better because they deck thin you. Remember how I said the princesses are good in the late game when they can repeatedly draw Sleeping Beauty and their direct-to-DVD sequel actually makes them draw more 5s? The plants get you there faster. And on top of that, there's also InstaGrow. I have to think about what side I have to point to get that thing. InstaGrow is going to be 5 power. Extra plate on your turn when you're playing with the princesses. It's not going to be 3, it's not going to be 4, it's 5. And that's actually a really big deal. So overall, I think the princesses are actually just about the sum of their parts. You might really find something that's significantly less than the sum of its parts in zombie princesses in a 3 or 4 player game, but that almost doesn't matter because zombies and princesses are so good in 3 and 4 player games that you might just run over your opponents without really noticing that you aren't quite getting the full power out of each individual faction. And the last partner issue is, of course, you periodically hear somebody comes up with a thread on the internet about princess shapeshifters or princess superheroes or possibly shapeshifter superheroes. Because with princess shapeshifters, oh my god, you've got 5 power mimics all the time, this must be tremendous. Well, yes, 5 power mimics are nice. And having 6 different other 5 power minions to select from with your doppelganger is also nice. Unfortunately for this deck, it's also nice to be able to search for something with your Gelf. And Gelf is the Shapeshifters 4. Gelf's ability swaps it with a 4 power or less minion in your deck. And the princesses are giving you absolutely none of those. So that cuts a little bit off of the power level of the deck. And they have another problem which may be a little less obvious. The Shapeshifters' actions transmogrify and really let the Shapeshifters function as if they already have movement cards in their deck, because they don't say play the new minion here or play the new minion at this base. They just let you play the new minion anywhere. And so some of the princess's movement starts to get redundant, and also both factions have a little bit of the same problem, that they have a lot of different good actions, and so the deck gets action hoggy when both factions start fighting for your action plays. I'm not saying in any way that Princess Shapeshifters is bad, but it's not going to be consistently great either. And then the other big synergy deck that I don't think is quite as big as some people say it is Princess Superheroes. And this one is a little trickier to understand why it's not great. Superheroes in general suffers from a specific problem that its plan is a little bit slow. Once it gets started, its plan runs on rails. And by that I mean you're sort of doing what you're doing at the speed you're doing it. And when it works, it really works. And when it doesn't work, it really, really doesn't work. And when I'm playing the superheroes, I want to have a partner faction that covers the matchups where my opponent has some way to mess with the superheroes' plan. And the princesses mostly make the superheroes already winning matchups even more disgustingly winning than they were already. And I don't think the princesses really help with the superheroes' bad matchups. I'll get more into how you mess with superheroes when I come to the superheroes video, because it's not something that right now I'm prepared to give a good explanation of exactly how to counter them.